Hello, my name is Nick Pulice, and today we'll be talking about dealing with a difficult client, specifically focusing on how to handle clients who are non-compliant, resistant to advice, or have unrealistic expectations. This is a really important topic, especially for anyone going into fields like accounting, finance, or consulting, or really any client-facing role, as these technical skills are important, but in many cases your ability to manage client relationships is what determines your success long term. In this presentation, I'm going to walk through the different types of difficult clients you might encounter, the challenges they create, and most importantly, practical strategies you can use to handle these situations professionally while still protecting yourself and your organization. So why does this matter? Well, client relationships directly affect things like revenue, retention, and reputation. A single difficult client interaction, if handled poorly, can lead to lost business or even damage to your firm's credibility. In fields like accounting, there's also a compliance aspect. If a client doesn't cooperate or pushes for something inappropriate, it could expose you to legal or ethical risks. Another key point is that most client conflicts don't actually come from technical mistakes, they come from miscommunication, unclear expectations, or misunderstandings. And the reality is, no matter how skilled or experienced you are, you will eventually deal with difficult clients. So the goal isn't to avoid these situations, it's to be prepared to handle them effectively. When handled correctly, these situations can actually strengthen trust and show clients that you are professional, reliable, and capable under pressure. There are several common types of difficult clients, and recognizing them early makes a big difference. First are non-compliant clients. These are clients who don't provide information, miss deadlines, or ignore requests. Second are resistant clients. These individuals push back against your advice or believe that their approach is better than yours. Third is clients with unrealistic expectations. This can involve timelines, pricing, or outcomes that just aren't feasible. You may also encounter disorganized clients who create confusion due to poor record keeping and lack of structure. These clients often bring a higher level of stress in interactions that is never really needed. And it's also important to remember that these behaviors often come from stress, lack of knowledge, or past experiences, not necessarily bad intentions. That mindset will help keep you in a more professional mindset and will help you respond appropriately. So let's start by taking a closer look at non-compliant clients. These are clients who consistently fail to provide necessary information, delay responses, or ignore deadlines altogether. In accounting, a common example would be a client who doesn't send required tax documents until the last minute, or during an audit fails to provide supporting documentation. The risks here go beyond inconvenience. Delays can lead to missed deadlines, inaccurate financial reporting, and even regulatory penalties. It could also create inefficiencies on your end, forcing you to rush work or reallocate time, which impacts other clients as well. So while it might seem like a minor issue at first, noncompliance can quickly escalate into a much larger problem. To effectively handle noncompliant clients, structure and consistency are key. First is to set expectations early. At the beginning of the engagement, it is important to clearly outline deadlines, required documents, and responsibilities. Second is to use written communication as much as possible. Emails provide a record of requests and make it easier to track what has or hasn't been completed yet. Providing checklists is also extremely helpful. Many clients aren't intentionally non-compliant, but they just don't know exactly what's needed. Another important strategy is explaining consequences in a professional way. For example, instead of sounding frustrated, you might say, if we don't receive information by this date, it could delay filing or affect accuracy. And finally, consistent follow up is critical. Sometimes clients just simply need reminders, and staying persistent while still being respectful can make a really big difference. At the end of the day, the key is to be firm but not confrontational. Let's talk about resistant clients now. These are clients who push back on your advice, question your expertise, or insist on just doing things their own way. For example, a client might want to take a tax position that isn't supported by regulations or ignore internal control recommendations during an audit. This type of client can be particularly challenging because it puts your professional judgment at risk. In some cases, it can create ethical dilemmas if the client is asking you to do something that isn't appropriate or goes along with compliance. So, how do you handle these types of clients? Well, the first step is always to listen. Instead of immediately correcting them, you should try to understand their reasoning, asking questions like, "Can you walk me through your thinking?" This not only shows respect, but also helps you identify the root of their concern. Once you understand their perspective, you can then respond with clear, evidence based explanations. For example, referencing tax laws, accounting standards, or even just prior experiences with other clients. It can also be helpful to present options. Instead of framing it as a right versus wrong, explain different approaches and the risks associated with each of those approaches. For instance, we can take this approach, but it increases the likelihood of audit risks. And very importantly, is to document your recommendations. If a client chooses to go against your advice, having that documented protects you professionally and legally. Another very common issue is unrealistic expectations. Some clients expect immediate results, lower fees, or outcomes that simply aren't achievable given the scope of work. For example, a client might expect a complex financial analysis to be completed in a day, or assume that certain tax liabilities can be completely avoided. These expectations often come from a lack of understanding about the complexity of the work that's involved. If these expectations aren't addressed early, they almost always lead to frustration and dissatisfaction. The best way to manage this is with clarity and transparency. You should start by clearly defining the scope of the engagement, what's included and what's not. Next is to set realistic timelines and explain why those timelines are necessary. This helps clients understand that process takes time for a reason. It's also important to communicate limitations. For example, you might explain that certain outcomes depend on external factors or regulations. One of the most important principles here is to avoid overpromising. It can be tempting to say yes to everything just to satisfy the client, but that often leads to bigger problems later on. Instead, it's better to just set realistic expectations up front and then exceed them if possible. Some of the most challenging situations, though, involve emotional or aggressive clients. These clients may express anger, frustration, or even try to pressure you into making quick decisions. For example, a client might become upset over unexpected tax liabilities or delays and direct that frustration towards you, even if it's not necessarily your fault. In these situations, your reaction is extremely important. Responding emotionally or defensively can escalate the situation very quickly. And because of that, here are some de-escalation strategies. To de-escalate these situations, you should start by staying calm and composed. You should acknowledge the client's feelings without necessarily agreeing with them. For example, by saying, "I understand this is frustrating and I want to help resolve it." You should also use active listening, letting the client fully explain their concerns before responding to them. If the situation becomes too heated, it's okay to pause and revisit the conversation later as well. But most importantly, you should shift the focus towards solutions. You should ask questions like, "What outcome would you like to see?" or "Here's what we can do moving forward." This helps move the conversation away from the emotion and closer towards actually reaching a solution to the problem. With that being said, strong communication is the foundation for handling all types of difficult clients. It's important to be clear and concise, avoiding overly technical language that might confuse clients. You should also always confirm understanding, either by summarizing key points or asking follow-up questions. Following up in writing is especially important. It ensures both parties are aligned and provides documentation if issues arise later. In many cases, simply improving communication can prevent difficult situations from happening in the first place. Maintaining professionalism in these scenarios is also critical, especially in these challenging situations. This means staying objective and not taking things personally, even if a client is being difficult. It also means consistently upholding ethical standards, regardless of pressure from the client. Setting boundaries is another important aspect. Being professional doesn't mean agreeing to everything, it means handling situations respectfully while still protecting your responsibility. Your behavior in in these situations reflects not just on you, but also on your entire firm. While many situations can be managed, there are times when escalation is necessary. If there are ethical concerns, repeated noncompliance, abusive behavior, or significant legal risks, it may actually be appropriate to involve a supervisor or even disengage from the client entirely. For example, if a client insists on reporting inaccurate information, continuing the relationship could expose you to serious consequences later down the line. Disengaging from a client is obviously never ideal, but sometimes it is actually the most responsible decision. Protecting your integrity and your firm should always come first, no matter who the client is. To conclude, here are a few key takeaways from this presentation. First is to be proactive and to set expectations early and clearly. Secondly is to communicate effectively and consistency. Third is to maintain professionalism at all times, even in difficult situations dealing with difficult clients. Fourth is to document everything, to protect yourself and your work. And fifthly and finally is to focus on solutions rather than problems. Dealing with difficult clients is a skill that develops over time. And mastering it can significantly impact your success in any client facing role, not just in accounting roles. Thank you for your time.